Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome, to give a keynote address on building brand Africa through strategic storytelling, Thabile Ngwato, the CEO of Rapid Innovation Group. Welcome, Thabile.
Thank you so much, Rahima, for that introduction, and thank you so much to 67 CEOs for having us. So for the last decade, I've honed in on becoming an entrepreneur in the broadcast and technology space, and all of this came to a culmination when I co-founded Newzroom Afrika in 2019. As the CEO of the business, one of my key responsibilities lies in making sure that we reach our vision of being Africa's leading and credible news and information service. Now, this means focusing on stories that put Africa on a global platform and help us to stand out as world-class storytellers. It is in this capacity that I stand in front of you today to discuss a topic I'm very passionate about, which is building brand Africa through strategic storytelling. So you might ask why storytelling matters. So individual perceptions and narratives are often shaped and formed by the issues and encounters people interact with daily. So whether experienced, seen, or heard, people formulate opinions on what they believe to be true. For decades, Africa has been portrayed through an incomplete lens. The outside world has often been told parts of a story, but not the whole. And because no one is going to correct or change this, it's up to us to take the responsibility of owning our narrative. No one can tell our stories the way we do. No one can portray our people the way we can. And no one can showcase our news and views the way we know how. The way we tell our stories is linked to our DNA. And so the legitimacy thereof is what pushes us to be sincere when we craft specific narratives. Stories create emotional connection, and strategic storytelling in particular helps associate with African brands, cultures, and people on a more human level. For South Africa, history has shown that if we don't tell our own stories, others will, and often with preconceptions and ignorance. So without our own voices, storytellers, journalists, filmmakers, and influencers being the ones to shout out and amplify our narratives, we are actually nothing. We are the ones responsible for reframing the perspectives of how we are perceived. And we must be consistent to reinforce our overall brand stance as brand Africa. Now, on to continental positioning. I think I speak for most of us when I say there is a collective fatigue when people refer to all the countries in Africa as Africa. We are a continent of 54 countries that are rich in diverse languages, systems, cultures, and economies. The upside of the continental unity that we must showcase to the world is the wealth of our multiplicity. When you look at the rest of the world as it stands, this is undoubtedly our main unique selling proposition. Our diversity, as often as it brings us to loggerheads, is actually one of our purest currencies. From tourism to natural resources, film and television, fashion, technological innovations, and the overall cultural splendor we have to offer, we truly are the place to be. No one in the world is positioned in the way that we are, not only geographically, but from a viewpoint of being culturally wealthy. And having said all of this, it is then important to weave in messaging that positions us correctly wherever possible. Without establishing the solid roots of our existence, we can't go anywhere. Storytelling in action. Having co-founded a news and current affairs channel, as well as founded a content hub where creating original content is at the center of what we do, I am no stranger to the true power of storytelling. In the news space, the concept of storytelling holds an even heavier mantle because we are tasked with accurately and responsibly portraying the real-life stories of both newsmakers and everyday people. Our stories carry weight because they can quite literally save lives and bring relief to the disenfranchised. What they can also do is bring a global spotlight to both the plight and triumphs of an entire continent. So it matters greatly. As Newzroom Afrika, our vision is to be Africa's leading and credible news and information service. Our local perspective is unmatched in that our focus is purely on the real human story. We pride ourselves in reflecting to our viewers that we are part of their everyday lives and part of their communities. We are the voice that brings their stories to life, Another of the case studies that we've worked on over the last year is with South Africa's official marketing agency, Brand SA. Using our platform along with strategic creative collateral, we have been able to execute campaigns that speak to the current play your part messaging to all South Africans, highlighting the work being done in the country. Because nation building has always been one of our goals at Newzroom Afrika since inception, it is with this in mind that we embarked on this collaboration. In order for us to successfully achieve storytelling in action, we need to constantly ask ourselves two questions. One, what are the current stories being told? And two, what are the gaps that one might find in the way that they are being brought to light? These are the questions that fuel the purpose of the outcome. Another area I'm deeply passionate about as a founder is that of investing in platforms that ultimately showcase storytelling. Building Africa-owned media and tech platforms has been one of my biggest visions as an entrepreneur. No one is going to willingly create space for us as Africans, and so we must create it for one another. Engaging one another on global amplification and network building is what will make sure that we tap into the true African spirit of rising together. Now, we know there are many challenges along this journey, and so being aware of them is also critical. As much as I alluded to a unity earlier, Africa can sometimes be fragmented. Stereotypes and bias can also creep up at times, along with language and accessibility barriers and limited funding across the board. Despite these, there is much that can be done with the collective muscle of key players. This leads me to my next point, which is our role as leaders, founders, and thought leaders. The mission of building Brand Africa through strategic storytelling is not one that can be tackled alone. We have the advantage of having many key players who can effectively make sure that the stories we tell are showcased in a way that brings prestige, honesty, and staying power. From a private sector perspective, we need to continue looking at developing and sustaining meaningful brand partnerships and exploring media investments that accommodate the context of our continent. Corporate storytelling is another aspect we can further push to showcase what we have to offer and have been able to do for decades. On the government side of things, one could look at cultural diplomacy as a means of fostering strategic relationships as well as an export of our creative industries. In South Africa, there have been many successful case studies on this front, which we've observed, such as in the visual art space. The likes of Nelson Makamo and Wanda Buhlembambo have enjoyed international acclaim here. On the literature side of things, the Sunyatis and Zakes Mdas of this world have played a significant role in amplifying African stories. A concerted effort in supporting the export of our creative industries is therefore critical in advancing our stories. In closing, strategic storytelling isn't just marketing, it's identity building. To build Brand Africa is to reclaim Africa's image, tell its stories with dignity and pride, and ensure the world sees the continent as a place of opportunity, complexity, and most importantly, brilliance. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I feel like I've been in a whirlwind masterclass, and I was sitting there taking notes furiously, even though I do lecture on some of these things. I'm like, yes, 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 because it's such a pertinent thing. It's often seen as a soft issue, often seen as a by the way. And I guess my question for you is, from a South African perspective, bringing it back home, where do we get it right? Where and who can we look to towards around how they've gotten strategic storytelling right? And I think you've given us some examples of how government specifically, you've put the Zakes Mda story in, and in how in arts and in culture that's been evident. And you also gave us a hint of that corporate must be doing more of it. If we were to sit down and pinpoint where our strategic storytelling and the specific messaging has been captured really powerfully, where is that? And I'm obviously going to ask you the converse. Where is our messaging and story not conducive for the narrative that we need to be building and we need to be taking care of our brand in terms of how this aligns to the direction that we want to go? So if you could, please indulge those two perspectives so we've got something to play with in terms of linking to what we know and what we can see and where we are perhaps getting it wrong. And I'm going to invite the audience in the meantime. Please write on the chat so that we can have some questions for Thabile. I can hijack this conversation. That's not what we're here for. So please do write your questions in the chat or raise your hand so that I can direct them towards her. Thabile, please.
Thank you for that question, Rahima. So I'll start with an example of excellence when it comes to strategic storytelling. I think the Multi-Choice Group, which is one of our partners, has done a great job at this. They've been able to create broadcast platforms that essentially showcase the talent that we have on the continent, that showcases the stories that we have on the continent. And I think they've done a great job in also collaborating with some international partners as well. And one thing that I think some storytellers shy away from at times is collaborating with other storytellers. But we've seen that in order to give some of our stories legs, we need to be able to collaborate with publishers, with distributors from across the world to be able to take our stories further. So for me, they are a true example of excellence. I would then say Newzroom Afrika as well. We launched our channel in 2019, and initially our channel was only meant to broadcast to the SADC region. And about 100 days post the channel's launch, we then got a second feed, which is essentially a rest of Africa feed that then takes our feed across the 52 countries in Africa. And we've been able to strategically capture some of the markets, particularly in East and West Africa. And so I would say the way we package our news speaks to not only a local market, but it also speaks to a continental market. And part of our growth strategy is to look beyond the shores of Africa. So that's where I would say those are the two examples for me where we see excellence when it comes to strategic storytelling. I think there are instances where we get it wrong. A lack of collaboration is definitely one. And then also telling stories that only give a certain narrative around us. I think what we've found is that yes, bad news and sensationalized news does give you ratings, but at the same time, it may not always be a positive reflection of who we are as Africans and an accurate reflection of who we are as Africans. And I think that's where we sometimes get it wrong, where we feel like we can't sell positive stories about our continent because we don't believe that they'll sell. But content that is compelling, content that is produced at the highest and at levels, high quality levels, actually does sell, essentially regardless of what the genre is. And I think we need to take a good look at ourselves and reflect when it comes to some of the genres that we always find comfort in as Africans.
Lovely points around the collaboration, multidisciplinary, multinational. I think that when we talk economically about how we got a huge diaspora on the African continent, which doesn't just speak to South Africans or individual nations, the African diaspora is really well placed globally to be also not just our narrators, but also custodians of the stories that we're telling. And so the ability to access those, it seems to be such a powerful thing. And I'm excited that once you go on to the rest of the continent, there's nothing more exciting than being able to tune into local news that is tuned into African news. And I think for me, that's been part of the missing angle, that we have a very South African based news framework. I'm using the word framework, could be incorrect, but a lot of the news that we get doesn't richly cover the rest of the continent. And I always give the example that if you go to the streets of another country on this continent and they're talking African news, there's detail. They will ask you details about your politicians that you yourself at home don't know, because that's the nature and the depth of the coverage that they have. And so this ability to just not just collaborate, but be present on the African continent speaks to a cohesion of an agenda that we speak about, but we actually have to enact in how we are engaging with the narratives on the ground and owning that. I think when you talk about the stories that need to be not just the stories that are popular, but are compelling and drive to that. That brings the question of then who's the custodian of storytelling? Where should custodianship of storytelling actually sit? Is it waiting for the news agencies, which has typically been the traditional way, or has it been democratized where the average citizen now is actually a key storyteller and I guess the person who is in a better position to give contemporary news, which is not just about the bad and the absolutely evil, but normalizing the normalized African experience. What's your take on that before I bring in other contributors to the conversation?
Look, the news space has evolved greatly over the years, and what we've seen is something called citizen journalism,
Yeah.
where essentially, if I'm on a street and something happens, I'm able to get on my phone and write that that thing has happened. So, news agencies in particular have had to also shift and re strategize how they provide the news because we're no longer breaking news per se. That's no longer, the heartbeat of our business model. The heartbeat of our business model, though, is providing the analysis, is going in depth and providing the rich media because we've got the tools, we've got the cameras, we've got the technology to be able to provide the rich media. And I think for us, that's worked really well. We launched in 2019, and I think that was a great time because technology had evolved so much then, but also we had seen the advent of citizen journalism through social media as well. And so we've incorporated all those elements, so digital media, the rich media space, linear TV, which is where our channels sit as well, in order to have a multi-channel platform that works for the viewer regardless of where they are. So we're almost catching the viewer where they are. And I think that essential collaboration, we can refer to it as a collaboration with citizen journalism, has worked really well for us.
That's awesome. I'm going to go into the real news, fake news, but I think there is there are two key questions coming in, which is, I guess this is specifically around Newzroom Afrika. How do you support SMEs with storytelling? And I think one of the challenges around the access to media and access to platform has been a fundamental element of cost, because airtime costs money, right? What are the innovations and ways of looking at support which allows, I guess, access, prevalence, and also just reach of audience? What is your approach to that?
So when it comes to information around SMMEs, when we first launched the channel in 2019, we launched with a program called Business Unusual. And essentially, that program was tailored specifically for SMMEs. We did end it, I think, at the end of the second season of the show because we had program changes. But at the same time, I think we are definitely looking at ways to bring it back because attached to the Business Unusual brand was also seminars and similar conferences such as these where SMMEs could engage with key stakeholders to be able to, find ways to interact and also find support for their businesses. So that's something that we definitely have as a key part of our programming strategy, but also our development strategy. So that's one. In terms of us as a business, because Newzroom Afrika is part of a group, which is Rapid Innovation Group, right? As a business, we're very big on working with SMMEs. I always say we've been able to create an ecosystem where other SMMEs thrive within our business. A lot of the services that we have internally, from our canteen, our catering services, stationery, photography services, etc. All the services that encompass what the group needs are all provided by SMMEs. So businesses that are also owned by young people, are owned by women, are owned by Black people in particular. So we've been very deliberate and intentional about ensuring that us, as a wholly women-owned, Black-owned group, that we also provide those opportunities at group level, but then also from a Newzroom Afrika and from a content perspective, we look at ways to then create content that speaks to those SMMEs. Through Ray Content Hub, which is our content production company, we are also looking at ways to create content that specifically speaks to the empowerment of people. I mentioned earlier on when the Q&A started that a lot of the time there's a notion that when it comes to content, people are not going to buy into content that speaks to empowerment. But we want to change that narrative and create content that is, again, compelling, but that speaks to the needs of our society. And young people need education, they need to be empowered, but most importantly, they also need opportunities. And so whatever content that we create in the spaces where we do create that content, we are keeping that in mind, and we're very intentional about tapping into that specific market.
Thank you so much, Cecile, for that question and that rich response that really gave us good perspective. Actually, some of the narrative that you're sharing with us without actually saying it specifically is owning your value chain, right? And by owning your value chain, the ability to direct and redirect and specifically, I guess, select who gets to participate and what that means from an economic empowerment, but importantly, trading on the skills and competencies and really looking at that's how you make a holistic system work. You create your own chain and you also ensure that you're including those with whom you have a target interest group in. And I think that's a rich way of us sitting back and saying, what are the narratives that are changing even as we are working in the space? What are the conscious narratives that we're looking to build? So it doesn't always come out as a newsflash story, but we can sit back and say, by evidence, this is how we're actually creating a brand new narrative, which I think is a very powerful positioning that you've just shared with us. Amina asks us, how do you maintain what the audience wants versus what is necessary, even if it's not considered popular? And I think you alluded a little bit to this when you mentioned that, listen, we have to look at education and empowerment and other imperatives as well as a societal need, as a developmental state. There are some imperatives that the state cannot do that we all, as conscious leaders and citizens, have got to infuse into how we do business. But how do you do this in terms of what you communicate in an era of fast communication?
I think first and foremost, when we first launched the channel, we were certain about the kind of platform that we wanted to create it. And what we have internally that some platforms don't even have is an internal audience insights division. So we've got audience insight specialists internally who essentially provide the necessary information and statistics and data around what our audience is watching, what are they interested in, and when they're not watching us, what else are they interested in? So first and foremost, that gives us, a key USP to be able to know exactly what makes our audience tick. That's the first thing. The second thing is that as a news platform, we have a huge responsibility. Our first responsibility is to provide news that is factual and news that is accurate, first and foremost, before anything else. But I think there's another responsibility that isn't spoken about a lot, and that one is of nation building. Because in as much as we need to provide the facts, we also need to be, the same way you are calling out bad behavior, you also need to applaud good behavior and highlight the good stories and the good things that are happening in our country and the good things that are happening in the rest of our continent and the rest of the world. So that responsibility is something that I think we've been able to weave in even in our editorial policy to say, when you are telling a story, of course, first and foremost, you have your 5 W's and an H. But beyond that, what is your responsibility and how you communicate it? Because we consider our tagline is our news, our views. So we are the voice of the people. So how are you representing the people and how are you providing information to people in such a way that they can be empowered? Because it's not for us to give information in such a way that we are making decisions on behalf of citizens. We are giving them information so that they can be empowered to make the decisions that they need to make for their lives. So I think that's what has worked for us as a news platform. When it comes to our content business and our content hub, which is Ray, that one is slightly different because there we do both scripted and unscripted content. And in that sense, you essentially follow the eyeballs. So we know the genres that work. And we know the platforms that work. And it's creating content, yes, that platforms are looking for. So if you're creating, for example, for a Showmax, they would tell you we're looking for this type of genre for this time slot for this demographic. And that's why audience insights across the board are really important. But there is a way to strike that balance. And I think it becomes difficult for platforms to strike any balance when they don't know who they're speaking to. So what we did is, first and foremost, we invested in our audience insights to ensure that we know what our viewers are looking for and where we need to find them. So we are essentially meeting them where they are. And that's how we've managed to strike the balance.
Wow, that sounds like a fine, fine balance of meeting the audience where they are when we've got such changing needs and demands. And as we have access to global platforms and global sources of content and information, how does a local South African outfit playing in this field stay relevant? We've got players in the market who not only have been around for a long time, but come with very deep pockets. And also have got a great reach. And I think when just as an example, just seeing what Netflix has been able to do in this space, I know it's not a best example, but been a level of disruption from some of the traditional players that have been in this space. But that comes with a very healthy balance sheet. That comes with a very, but it's also obviously the insights have been very key in keeping them going. So is there is the market for South Africa growing, or is the growth actually outside of South Africa for the space that you're in? I say this, and I don't know if it's true. There were rumors around things like Europa TV not, going down, and sitting back and saying, well, what's the future? What does the future actually look like in this space where access to information is more accessible? Access to information is not the barrier it used to be. It might be barrier from a financial perspective, but the information exists, the models exist to be able to mine it. If you've got that information, one of the key things that you said that I think we shouldn't lose sight of is not just the information access, but the ability to analyze it and make sense of it. So it sounds like the key business for the future is analysts, right? And to be able to use that to also match that with human behavior. But what is the potential? Do you see this as a growth market, or do you see this more as a launch pad, and the rest of the markets on the continent and the world are actually where the opportunity lies? So as a South African entrepreneur looking to form part of the ecosystem, how should we be looking at storytelling? Is it a very selfish look at I'm telling a South African story, or do you use what you know about telling a story a South African way to tell a story to the rest of the world?
I think the benefit that we have is that we are telling stories strategically in two very different ways. So,
Okay.
on the news side, for example, like I mentioned earlier on, news platforms hardly ever break news anymore. But
Mm,
what we're seeing is that viewers are coming to our platforms for that in depth analysis, for that fact verification. In fact, we consider ourselves as Newzroom Afrika as a
100%.
verification portal because with all the deep fakes and the fake news and the misinformation, it is important to still have credible platforms that have teams of journalists, I mean, we have a research team, we have journalists, we have people on the ground, people inside the newsroom, constantly churning out information, but most importantly, verifying that information. And so the market exists and it continues to grow there. But it's growing in a different direction because people are no longer coming to you to just check. They're coming to you to verify and then stay on to get, the in-depth analysis. So that's on the news side. On the content side and on the storytelling from a scripted and unscripted perspective, the market there is also growing because what's great about the influx of many platforms that are being introduced to the continent, because if you think about it, 10 years ago we didn't have Netflix, we didn't have Amazon Prime, we didn't have accessibility to these platforms on the continent, and now we do. And what those platforms are looking for, I mean, Showmax is a good example. They've invested billions in African content, localized content. So when they look at the Nigerian market, they say, where are the Nigerian producers to be able to create content for Nigerians for that region? When they look at the South Africans, they're looking for South African producers to be able to create content for that region. So the market is constantly growing because as the competition grows, our local broadcasters are also finding ways to be able to reimagine how they can play a part as broadcasters. And I think that's created new opportunities for us. I mean, 2 years ago, we didn't have a content production company. We're currently working on 3 productions at the moment, for video on demand platforms. And the reason for that is because the opportunities have come up over time. And so we say, how do we get into this space? Because the platforms exist and the need for local content is definitely there.
I think that's brilliant because it not only shows an evolving landscape, but it also shows insights about what that landscape actually means from an opportunities perspective. I think often when we hear about changing landscape, there's a level of fear, a level of uncertainty, and a tendency to, just be reclusive and try to hold yourself into what you know. What it sounds like that to stay in this game and to be a relevant storyteller, you've actually not just got to manage and check what your stories are saying, but you've also be conscious of where people are at and how they're consuming that content. So if I was looking at a skills base in the sector, I'd be sitting back and saying, well, how am I a contributor to not only accessing the stories in terms of where they are, distilling sense and meaning, staying on it so that I can actually be that trusted point of information and of contact. You've mentioned the fact that part of the reason why people come to you is because you're trusted. In this era of misinformation and disinformation, How do you remain at the cutting edge of being trustworthy? What does trust look like, right? Because you can trade on trust because you can say, that's what I've been. You've been relying on me for this. But what are the key tenets of what trust is built on in this space of storytelling? Because there are so many, I always sit back and say, as soon as you go online, it's like going into DeepSeek, going into ChatGPT. There's so many reference points you can go to that will give you what looks like it's the truth. How do you maintain that credibility? What it needs to exist in you as an organization or its leadership, in your ethos, in what you are choosing to do and be a part of that makes you a continuously trustworthy reference point in an era of so much distrust?
So for us as Newsroom Africa, we live by we'd rather be right than be first. So the rush to be first is no longer necessary in the age that we live in. But you'd rather be right, meaning that you would have done your fact checking and that the viewer can rely on you to be that verification portal. What we've also done is that we are very human centric. So outside of Newsroom Africa, which is channel 405, we also have our vernacular bulletins, um, which we have on Mzansi Wetu, that's channel 163 on DSTV, and that's in isiXhosa and isiZulu. And that's our first sort of piloting of having journalists within communities in particular to focus more on the human story. So we are very human centric and focusing on real stories. And what we found is that community media for a long time has been ignored, right? Or the power of community media. So what we've done is we've been able to get into those communities, get our teams into those communities, and get the stories from the people themselves. And there's no better fact checking than the people who are actually living those lives and experiencing those lives. So for us, it's exactly those two things: being right rather than being first. And the second one is being human centric. So being the voice of the people, making sure that we are highlighting the people's story more than focusing on how we want to drive a particular narrative, because that's not our essence as a platform.
Sam, I'm seeing you coming up on screen. That always tells me that the organizer has got a
Yeah.
burning question that they don't want to leave you with asking. Sam, over to you.
No, thank you greatly, Raima, for a great conversation with Thabile, and thank you very much. And let me start by saying, Thabile, that when I was looking at the aesthetic and the professionalism of the presentation, the actual content, I'm like, wow, I must have disappointed you and your team that we couldn't host this conference physically, because I could see that no, that is what it was built or was designed for. And thank you, for honoring the invitation to do this virtually. I think my maybe question would be, going back to the topic, brand Africa. Before now, Africa as a continent has been tagged a dark continent. And obviously that narrative is changing. And thanks to platforms like Newzroom Afrika and other platforms. What Thabile, in your opinion, what would you, if there is brand Africa in this era, what would that be? A case in point, let's take United States. Obviously, it's a country, not to compare it to Africa as a continent. There is that thing of the American dream. And when you the nation, that's how they want, and they know how to tell their story in the play in the space in the place of positioning the nation. So I guess again the question is, if we do have as a continent brand Africa, what is that? And if we don't, how do we begin, to cultivate what, as a collective, as a continent, what when you hear Africa, the first thing that should come to your mind? Because again, if you look at the Western media, when they portray Africa, it's poverty, is all these kind of things. What should it be for Africa, Thabile?
Wow, what a broad question. Thank you for that, Sam. I think first and foremost, I actually wish I could pull up a video that we recently did that our creative and communications agency created for Brand SA for Africa Month. And essentially, the crux of that video and that commercial was around the future of Africa, and how we envision it. Imagine Africa. And we had diverse people from across the continent sitting and dreaming about the Africa that they're envisioned, the Africa that they are building, the Africa that they're participating in. Some were envisioning people being able to access medication through delivery by drones. That was one of the ladies. I think she was an Ethiopian woman that said that's her dream for Africa. A young man was saying being able to access, different types of careers and education without any barriers, because there are still children who don't have access to information and access to education at the level, that the rest of the world has. So that's just an example of how we see Africa and what brand Africa should be. It's what is the Africa that we imagine? And I think conversations like we are having today, a platform like 67 CEOs and what you're trying to build is part of that, right? We need to start having those conversations. But another thing that can be done and that should be done, and I'm definitely going to participate in, is bringing together different stakeholders across the continent. Agencies such as Brand SA, so whatever the version is in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Morocco, bringing them together to be able to craft a message for the continent. I don't think we have anything like that. Yes, we came up with Imagine Africa for this particular campaign that we were doing, but I think we need to come up with something that is unified, that is continental, that speaks to who we are as a people. Because in as much as we say, yes, we are 54 separate countries, but we are one. And I think having that one message will also show the rest of the world that we stand together and that we have so much to offer. But I think we are the Africa that I imagine. Rahima, so eloquent, asking amazing questions, engaging. That's the Africa that I imagine that I want to be a part of. Sam, the work that you are doing in terms of empowering SMEs and access to opportunities and information, that's the Africa that I want to be part of. And I hope that I'm playing a role in the work that I'm doing to be able to create this Africa that we imagine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm
Thank
gonna
you.
come
Thank
in
you
because she
so much.
complimented me, right? So I'm gonna be like, oh. Thank you so much. So I'm inviting the audience. So if we can have hands up or um, even just, write on the chat. And I'm just going to keep the conversation going as we do that because I know that I like to optimize the time and the captive audience we have in you for the conversation and for maximum impact. I always say to people that the conversation in the room is sometimes just a stimulus point for the conversations we're able to have outside the room. I always use the example of my first TEDx experience, an event that I hosted that had 30 people in the room, but have over a million views outside of that room. And that's the power of being able to capture content and information in the way that makes it accessible through bridging that digital divide and access on free media that allows people to be part of conversations when they're not there. So honoring that and the opportunity to leverage the content and the construct. I guess my final question for you to reflect on, what is a question that you feel that, what is a question that you wish more of us asked of, that it would allow us to think more strategically about storytelling, that you don't think we pose enough of, that might be the stimulus to getting the right conversations going where they're not happening currently?
A few years ago, just after we launched Newzroom Afrika, one of our key stakeholders was sitting with me and I was discussing an upcoming marketing campaign that we were thinking of for Newzroom Afrika. And this was just an awareness campaign, essentially, to promote the channel. And she said, before you spend any amount of money, you need to ask yourself, what do I want to say? So what is it that I want to communicate? how do I want it to be received? Meaning, how do you intend it to land? And I think we're not asking ourselves enough of that. We are doing a lot. We are saying a lot, but we're not stepping back and saying, what is it that we want to say? And that has a lot of sub questions to it, right? Who are we? How do we want to be perceived? How do we want to be portrayed? But that can only be answered, and you can only get into the next level of those sub questions once you answer that first question. And I don't think we ask ourselves that enough in the quest for finding, passions and, finding purpose. What is it that you want to say? What is it you do? How do you want people to receive you? How do you want people to perceive you? And how do you want then this beautiful continent of ours to be received by the rest of the world? And that is an active conversation, and I don't think it's very open. It's not a single conversation. It's a multifaceted conversation that needs to happen across platforms, that needs to happen with, a multiplicity of stakeholders for us to be able to have those answers so that we can make the necessary changes that we want to make. So for me, I would say that's a critical question that we need to ask ourselves. I'm constantly asking myself that question as a woman in this day and age, as an entrepreneur, as a leader, as a CEO of the business, to say, what is it that I want to say? What is the message that I'm trying to drive out there in order to make an impact? Because I always say, I wouldn't do any of the things that I do if I didn't want to make an impact. And so how do you make an impact without answering that question first?
What a beautiful parting shot that is.